There is a movement amongst Gen Z coming to church, but what is behind that and what are they truly searching for? Hi, welcome to the channel. My name is Rev Dan. I'm a vicar in the Church of England. On this channel, you get all my views as a parish priest on all the Christian news happening in the world today. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, comment down below, and don't forget to hit that notification bell. Also, head over to Substack where I put extra content out over there. So today I'm with Deborah, and we're going to be speaking about young people and church, because so many young people are not coming to church. But there's this phenomenon at the moment, actually, that I've seen even in my local church, which is a small church, of younger people coming. But they're coming and they're asking lots of questions, and they want to know, what is Christianity? And that's one of the things. It feels like they have never been told about Christianity, and they want to know what it is, the truth, no holds barred, and also they are listening, which is absolutely great. So Deborah is part of that generation, and we're going to get into what Gen Z and all that are doing about Christianity, church, and perhaps other things in the world today. Because I have to admit, I'm not young anymore, but I got a young person here to speak about these things. So Deborah, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yes, of course. Hello, I am Deborah, and you can find me also on Instagram at babbage.is.back. I am the author of the Babbage Parallel series, Reflections on the Decline of Belief in Science and Religion, and my religion section of my book covers specifically Christianity, and it talks about the different systems that have been in place for a long time and different aspects of church that you may not necessarily articulate, but you are perhaps well aware exists. I talk about those aspects of church life and how they affect people who go to church, particularly Gen Z, which is my generation, so that's people born between 1997 and 2012. So you'd be very interested to know that, as Rev Dan says, a lot of young people are actually seeking Christianity as a way of finding moral value, family values, and other societal aspects. We're not like millennials, who are often very famous for being quite rebellious, and Gen Z appears quite differently. Millennials, for example, are more likely to sit on their phones, and Gen Z are more likely to put them away and speak to you face to face. So I can't wait to answer some of Rev Dan's questions and have a lovely discussion today.
Yeah, so probably the first one is you pointed out a difference between millennials and Gen Z, and you're right, absolutely, millennials have got this reputation brought up on them by themselves, by the way. But what do you think is in a sense, the change or the backlash from that way of Gen Z looking at the millennials?
I think Gen Z sees their older siblings and or parents living a life that isn't indicative of their thriving. And this is something that I think Gen Z note across the board. So we've seen a rising divorce rate, but a lot of Gen Z kids know what it's like to grow up in broken homes and they don't like it. A lot of kids have grown up with single mothers and they recognise the absence of a father is a real problem. We were also raised in school to have a tolerance for absolutely everyone, even if everyone didn't tolerate us. And that becomes a problem. So Gen Z was encouraged to have certain values that millennials typically held, but struggled with them more than millennials did, because they could see widely in their own society that this was breaking down, and there were arguments happening on YouTube, in the media sphere. We could see that these things were not black and white, and that people were arguing that actually there were serious risks to society continuing the way we go. And we were seeing it at home and in our family lives and affecting our friends, for example.
And what, growing up in your generation, was the effect of seeing these different generations, but not really having any boundaries, any rules? You can be whatever you want to be. You can do whatever you wanted to do. What was that like?
Very difficult, because if you spotted a problem with it or found it jarring, you weren't allowed to do that. Particularly at school, when I was in sixth form, I perhaps would have come to some of the same tolerant conclusions in the end, but was afraid to think the wrong thing, have the wrong opinion and come to the wrong conclusion. Because if I come to the quote-unquote wrong conclusion, what's going to happen to me socially? It doesn't just affect you in the wider world, but it affects your friendship groups and those that you spend time with. It affects your popularity. There are aspects of that really come together. So principally it's a social issue. The second thing is that when you lose all identity, if you're stripped of all identity, that being a woman doesn't mean anything, well, what happens is you can be just like the boys, but you can't be. And you also don't know what it is to be a woman. So you're left in this space where you are an anomaly, but you're not an anomaly. Every other woman is growing up in the same position, and it's the same for boys. I think boys have suffered perhaps more. I think they really struggle to know what it means to be a boy or to be a man. It's very confusing because if you take identity away, you also take purpose away, you also take value away. And what you're left with is an empty canvas that's not allowed to be painted on unless it's painted in a completely unique way. And a lot of us share so many traits. Women share lots of traits, men share lots of traits. And so we're never able to create this lovely identityless canvas because it doesn't exist. We all have an identity and we all are affected by it. We're all a product of it. And it's very scary to be in the position of knowing that you can't escape that, but you also don't know what it is because you haven't been taught.
Yeah, well, I think it's well known and reported now that young men, the suicide rate young men is incredible. And we think about the loneliness of older people, but actually, like you say, if you're cut off, you're brought up in a digital world, and if you're cut off, if that cancel culture comes, well, if I got cancelled, I can cope because I know what the life is outside of that. But with your generation, it really is, I suppose, living on a knife edge. If I say the wrong thing, that's it, and I'm outcast. Does it feel like that? Is it quite stressful in that?
Absolutely. So principally when you're in school, it looks a bit different because there is the popularity contest that always exists in school. And so there is a sense in which that stress always exists. The problem really is that stress continues at home and then continues when you leave home. A lot of people, when they become adults, they say, well, no, I don't worry about what's popular. I just do what I want to do. That's what happens. When you're Gen Z, you don't get that luxury. Often on Facebook, all of your old friends and acquaintances, and maybe even people you didn't like very much, maybe you're still friends with you on Facebook, still watch what you do on Instagram. You don't ever have that freedom to completely leave those people's judgmental view. So you are somewhat controlled by it unless you actively seek to go against the grain, which can make other people who don't even know you join the club in ostracizing you. We also grew up, I think I was about 10 when Facebook came out, something like that. I would have joined around 13, 14, whenever the acceptance age was. And fundamentally, the way we communicated online established how popular we were, whether we had the right views, who we were as a person. It can be very difficult to break away from that. Even now, I'm 26 years old, and I still feel the effects of the fact that my brain developed alongside the rise of social media. And it's very hard to separate the two, particularly as I was in the public eye as well. So there was a double whammy there. But that presence means that it's easier to follow what's popular than it is to go against the grain and say, well, I'm actually quite a different person to that. And it can be the most benign things, but this can be very socially stressful.
So with sounds quite an awful age to grow up to be honest. So with that, especially if you have different views from what society is saying, and I suppose a frustration of not being able to even say, look, I just don't agree with that. Let's have a conversation without people saying, well, we don't speak anymore. You're just, you're ostracized. You're going to be cancelled. So do you think that the culture that has been grown up, that you've grown up with, has actually helped people start to question, is there more what life's about? And I tell you one thing, when I started theological college over 10 years ago, so probably just when you came up on Facebook, I I saw that my generation, we were slightly one step away from church. So our parents, there's a lot that stopped going to church. And so we were one step away from church. And the further away that you get from church and Christianity, then it passes down. And I was like, well, the next generation, they're going to be even further away. They're not brought up on any Christianity in schools. They're not going to church. They're not reading the Bible or anything like this. And so it's going to be even harder to reach them, because if my generation are not going to church, and that's shown with the age demographic in church, my real worry was your generation is completely lost, and the church has lost them. But it also seems like a movement of God. It's like a perfect storm. With this, you could be anything you want, do anything you want, and there's this whole cancel culture, this whole identity, this whole purpose, which is a massive thing. Actually, they're coming back to question. I'm not saying they're coming back to Christianity, but you guys are asking questions and you're seeking truth. And like I said before, you're listening. I get a lot of people telling me their opinions, and your generation is actually asking questions. They don't want woolly answers. For sure. I think you've grown up with woolly answers and listening. And at the start, I had to get used to it. It was quite unnerving because you're waiting, come back at me. No, we want to know. So, is that something, would you say that's right or roundabout there?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. In stripping people of everything, they go seeking an identity. And they might seek that by joining any number of groups. It's a little bit out of control. And a lot of people will have seen Gen Z online doing some pretty interesting things, and often doing it in groups that provide them an identity. But a lot of that gets old. For example, like creating an identity around a mental health issue. I'm so-and-so and I have depression and this is now. But then if they're cured of the depression and it goes away, maybe they're medicated, or maybe they get CBT or activation behavioural methods, suddenly they're not depressed anymore. Their identity's gone. So this is something that we see a lot. You'll see an individual who maybe is quite polarizing, forming an identity group, and then that identity group eventually falling apart because there is no central identity besides just the individual self. I think it is a shock to Christians. It's a shock to a lot of religions, actually, that Gen Z suddenly are knocking on the doors and finding them when they thought perhaps we're going to have to go out and reach them and speak to them and help them to build a life of value. And then all of a sudden they're knocking on the door saying, hi, I heard you have some values to offer. Can I learn more about that? And it is a big shock to people in religious circles, particularly in the church, because that was the opposite of what was expected. But from my perspective, Gen Z was raised to engage in a society that outside of the school halls never existed in the way it was described. And so people often say, oh, Gen Z thinks this, or Gen Z has these identity views. A lot of this was founded in school and taught in school, and we thought that was the right way. So we were taught this is correct. We go forward into the world, and the world says, hey, what's wrong with Gen Z? Why are they trying to disrupt society? Why are they so disruptive? Half of them never even intended on being disrupted. They thought it was the correct way to be. And then they see in their own life that maybe this doesn't work to build values on other concepts beside that which is tried and tested. Judeo-Christian values, particularly Christian values in the UK, has founded the nation. And so it's tried and tested, the family values that come with it, the piety that comes with it, the humbleness that comes with it, the concept that sin, for example, anybody can be sinning. Anybody who says they don't sin could actually be quite proud. And that's not good. And being overzealous, for example, is not encouraged. And these attributes can really be supportive of someone who needs structure. And that structure is provided. I would argue, however, some kids are going along to certain churches that are recruitment-based, recruitment-focused. They're not getting what they asked for because they're walking into a place that's rushing to baptize them, rushing to put it on the internet, tell everybody and run their cameras up and down the church and show all the young people who are there. And some of the young people don't mind it, particularly if they come from a Christian background, they sort of go along with it somewhat. But there's a lot of kids who, if they're looking for values, do not want to walk into a church and find a glorified nightclub where half the songs don't actually refer to God. Because if they are turning up to church, they are actually looking for God. And if they should be able to see and learn about God if they go to church. So I would argue that they are seeking depth. It has to be provided. You can't just sort of convert in a member of Gen Z who thinks very deeply and wants an identity, and then just leave them to sit in the church and rot while you go and recruit more people. They need to learn and study and think and go through a lot of things. They might have a lot of trauma, considering the way society has changed and moved. They may not have been raised in the same way that a lot of people watching have been raised. And so they may have very twisted views about family, twisted views about how to go forward. And if they're not understanding from the Christian perspective how that can be rectified, or I think it's considered to be deliverance even. If they're not understanding how that works and they're just being recruited and left, there's a high risk that you're going to lose them again in 10 or so years.
Yeah, it's crazy. You talk about the services. They come to the traditional service, the traditional communion service. And I remember in August speaking to eight of them turned up between 18 and 25. Some of them just for the first time in church for a long time or ever. And I said, why do you come to this service? And there was words like, well, it's got structure. It's actually comfortable. It's comforting to be here because there was structure. And they like the traditional stuff. And they're not afraid of it. And, churches, they got into this thing, well, if they haven't got a band or if it's not, the vicar's not cool or, it's embarrassing, or this is just old fuddy-duddy. But this has been going, actually it's been going on for a while. I remember going for an interview just after I finished my training, my curacy. And we were speaking at this interview of this phenomenon of younger people going to like Book of Common Prayer services and the cathedral growth back then, which is still continuing for people who were younger, seeking a new, for them, absolutely alien to anything they've ever known. And they come and they find it comforting. They love the structure. They love the words. They love liturgy. Again, it's words. This is what you're going to say. And it's like, and it's like, it is amazing. But you're right. There's also the truth thing. And I think they want to know truth, no holds barred. And they don't judge. They just say, you tell us and we go. Is that?
Absolutely. I think actually Gen Z is a great example of those who, for example, want hookups versus those who want marriage. Hookups are supposed to be interesting and exciting. You go to a bar, there's loads of music, there's loads going on, maybe you're drinking. That's the idea. Marriage is sometimes the boring stuff. And you see, Gen Z can get all of that. They don't want it. In fact, they're very averse to a lot of this. There's a record low of Gen Z even attending nightclubs, going to pubs. I certainly don't go to pubs. I've never drunk alcohol. No interest whatsoever. It's so available, it's kind of nauseating. I don't want it. But then the concept of building a life, that they don't necessarily know all about straight away or weren't raised with the concept straight away. So when they're turning up to church, they're not looking for a dopamine hit of how nightclubbish can this look, how exciting can this be, how great is the singer at the front. They're deliberately going because they're driven by the fact that they want a moral system. And there are fantastic speakers on YouTube who I think have actually fueled a lot of this, and one of them particularly is Jordan Peterson. The concept that clean your room, go and stroke a cat if you see one in the street, don't disturb people when they're skateboarding. This concept of living in community with others and finding what that means. And that drives young people to realise that when they structure their life, they get successful, they also get peace, and then they try to think, well, hang on a minute, where did these ideas come from? Well, it came from, in this country, it came from Christianity. And they want that, so they're going to go straight back to church, and they're not going to go to a church that tries to look atheist. They're going to go to a church that looks like it knows about God. I mean, Gen Z is very used to a lot of liberal concepts. For example, if a vicar is male and has a husband, for example, they probably wouldn't even register that particularly because it is so normal to us. But I think what they would be looking for is that those individuals live a life that is indicative of a peaceful life, one that recognises God and that is pious before God. And to every Christian, it seems that does look different, and the church is very split on whether such instances are really appropriate according to God. And I think those deeper discussions are really important to have because Christianity doesn't want to bend itself to the point that it's out of shape and it doesn't look like Christianity anymore. And in Islam, they will often say, oh, well, we never change, whereas the Christians always change. You see, ours is never changing, our concept is never changing. So it allows to some degree other religions to provide something that Christianity no longer provides. And in terms of church numbers, that's a risk to church numbers. I think they'll question that immediately. The case. It depends on each individual person, but they will question that. If they see contradictions, if they see things that don't make sense and don't have clear explanations, that will not make sense because then they will say, well, okay, it says this, but then you do this. That doesn't make sense. Well, did God just not mean this bit? But then again, they might pull up lots of aspects like not keeping, I think, cotton and linen together or not eating pork. Eating shellfish, for example. So there's a lot, particularly in the Old Testament. It is somewhat contextual. Some of it is so fundamental to Christianity, and some of it has changed over time. I think, from what I can tell, Jesus's attitude to it was perhaps more that it shouldn't be the case. I think it seems that Jesus hinted, but there's not anything that's particularly direct. So I guess it would be down to the scholars to decide really what those verses mean and which verses hold that central importance.
Yeah, well, I see with the kids coming in, they're more conservative in their views, and they, were the ones they might come to my church because they might know locally where I stand on these issues, and that's where they get the truth. So I don't know the other side in the sense where those kids, if they ever went to one of those churches. But they do come on and they say, some in the conversation was one of them on Sunday, and they said, this is what the Bible says. This is what it is. In fact, very comfortable saying that, and like you say before, in a growing up where they couldn't say, now they finding somewhere where they feel comfortable being saying that. But what's interesting, and I've seen this 2 or 3 times now, recently in the last few months, is the pushback isn't from the kids who start coming to church. There's a wariness from their parents. And that wariness is, and the same word that's being used, is that we're worried that you're joining a cult, which is really interesting. And I don't know where, in a sense, that comes from, because they're free to come and go and ask questions. Do you see anything in that?
I think Stephen Hassan, he's a very, very useful chap. He lives in America and he's studied cults for a very long time. And he came up with the bite model. And I think the bite model is really, really useful because we can assess if something is a religious establishment or whether it's a cult. And there are cults within every religion that we have to look out for. And knowing what they are helps us to see the difference between what is and what isn't. So the BITE model focuses on BITE, so behaviour control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. And if you're seeing 1, 2, maybe more, then it's not a safe place to be. Church, I've grown up in church and other religious establishments. I come from a mixed religious background, but when I attended church, the vast majority of churches I attended didn't show up on the bike model, and particularly not Church of England, Methodist, Baptist. That was more rare. Perhaps certain Baptist groups in the Americas, in the United States, maybe they might be slightly different, I don't know. But in British Baptist communities, it's very similar in many respects to Church of England. So although there's a high level of structure, there's not a high level of force. For example, if someone chooses to leave that church, they're not to stop contacting everyone else they know in that church or any family members that attend that church. There's no information control or behaviour control. They're not saying that you can only look at the Bible, but if you're catching somebody looking at something they shouldn't be looking at, quote unquote, that they're then ostracised. I think Christianity has actually been a great champion in the West for freedom. And so that does fly in the face of what it is to be a cult. Yes, it absolutely could, but I could also argue in this instance, for example, I attended orchestra from when I was 6 years old. It was a music school. My parents told me, you've got to really think about this because you're going to have to sit up straight, you're going to have to do what the conductor says, you're going to have to listen very carefully. And through that time at music school, it probably affected the way I sit, the way I speak, the confidence which I might have in public speaking or performing, and all of those things it has an impact on. And the fact that I have an aversion to clip-on bow ties, I think everyone should tie them properly, and that's a part of me. My orchestra was not a cult, but it did shape some of the etiquette values that I might have, and the way I might speak, and the way I might engage with the world. So the same can be said for anything. Usually, you'll find with people who become doctors, they often become very similar to one another because they're around each other, they're doing their night shifts, other doctors understand what it's like, and then sometimes you find that your humour, if you're a doctor, suddenly doesn't really translate well to everybody else. In fact, it might seem a bit crude, a bit odd. So there is always a sense in which you will develop an identity wherever you go, and what you do, and it will affect you. For example, I think Christianity is very good at describing that actually what goes in, what you watch, what you consume, what you listen to, does affect what comes out of your mouth and your attitude. And I do think that, in all fairness, whatever you do consume will in some way impact you. Does that make it a cult? No. But will parents have their little red flags going in their head? Perhaps. And it's the church's responsibility to have good accountability structures which help to reduce that anxiety, I think.
Yeah, well, especially with the safeguarding in the newspapers of the Church of England at the moment. And that's the thing, my response to those was to bring your parents to church. And part of the problem is, as I said before, they have not been brought up with church, and they've formed probably something in their mind of what church is now. And they see such a change in their child's behaviour that they can only, because they don't know church. And so they're going, this must not be a good thing. And yet it is a good thing because children are not, the younger. What age is Gen Z? What period does it cover?
1996 to 2012. So we're
Okay.
sort of 12 years old until 27, 28 years old.
Yeah. So my son falls into that. In fact, my daughter said the other day something about Gen Z because she's 2015, so she's the next generation. And she said Gen Z, and I said, no, it's not Gen Z. That's American. It's Gen Z. But I'm one of the older generations, and and he's grown up, doesn't drink, say, we're not going to have sex till we get married, never going to do drugs. They live in a very different world, very online world, but their attitude is so different that some of it would fit. There's probably a lot of people out there who would fit in with Christianity, but without being Christian, because they're living the Christian values by pushing back on the previous generation.
Well, there are Christian atheists as well. And Christian atheists are really interesting because they're atheists who haven't actually let go of their Christian values and don't want to. And I find that so interesting because this is something I discovered. I came away from church because I saw a lot of issues within church, and then realised that actually a lot of people who live their life without a religious foundation or faith foundation, they didn't have the same values as I did. And by values, I mean they didn't put things on a pedestal in the same way I did. There were certain things to me that I genuinely believed were sacred. And it's very difficult if the people around you see everything as sort of the same value. And you personally see certain aspects of your personal life, certain aspects of looking towards marriage, for example, as really, really important, really, really sacred. So there are actually atheists who have Christian values, and I think Ayaan Hirsi Ali was very interesting because she converted to Christianity not because she believed in God, but because she was so acutely aware of the strength of Christian values. And I think Richard Dawkins very recently said that he's sad to some extent that actually those values have gone because he lived in a time where he could sit in those values and it was considered normal. And now all of a sudden those values are not normal and you're left with a society that doesn't know exactly how to behave in so many different circumstances that are so fundamental to how we raise our families and how we go forward.
And you think,
yeah,
the internet and the false narrative that's put out on the internet, which your generation started to see through, is fueled that.
Yes, because I think the more we notice that there's a push towards something, young people naturally rebel. That's kind of how we function. So we push in a direction, particularly if we don't think it adds up, and kids are really good at seeing if something doesn't add up, particularly online, because we're very quick to spot something that looks scammy, something that looks like it's said to make lots of money or said to be sensationalist. We do, for the vast majority, pick that up very quickly. The immediate response is to pull against it and pull back and to be rebellious. And that is kind of the bang that comes after building up this pressure of don't think the wrong thing, don't do the wrong thing. And then eventually people start talking to each other, my generation in particular, and they say, do you agree with this? No, actually, I don't. Well, I don't agree with it either. I don't think we're supposed to be without an identity. I don't think we should have a month long of different celebrations towards certain things because it looks very specialised, it doesn't make any sense, it doesn't deal with the real questions. And then the whole thing just, bang, crashes and don't want anything to do with it because it's too stressful, it's not pleasant, and it doesn't allow us to think, which is something that young people really like to do. It's one of the reasons that young people are so difficult and belligerent. That's part of who we are. We question everything, we push back, we spot things in our parents that we think aren't right, and we can get angry about that and responsive to that. That's who we are inherently. So of course we were going to see through this concept. But from my personal belief, there are certain aspects to which, for example, children benefit from having a mother and a father. They benefit from the duality of that. They benefit from having dad in the home, which is becoming, perhaps it's going the other way now, but it was becoming scarce. We had, I think, 3.5 million single mothers in England, and they're raising maybe 2, maybe 3 children. And we're in a position now where those kids know inherently dad's meant to be there and dad's meant to know his job. And if dad doesn't, then suddenly children can find it really difficult, and it's not impossible, but they can find it really difficult to regulate their emotions, regulate their behaviour, and create boundaries in the home. So what do? They go looking for their father, perhaps somewhere else. And perhaps it's best they go looking for it in a church than they go looking anywhere else, because there's a lot of people out there who would happily say, oh yes, I'll take the place of your father, but they could be far, far more dangerous than anything we can imagine. So having strong safeguarding in place in church allows children to find boundaries where perhaps, particularly in single parent households, that's not something mum was able to put in place because mum is exhausted and she has every right to be. And that's a part of it.
Yeah, that's why I'm, fascinated about this generation just seeking truth and won't accept any willingness. I think it's refreshing, really refreshing, and you don't have to hold back with them. Is you speak to different generations, you have to feel your way. What are they accepting? When am I going to get some backlash or opinion, or But they're just, we'll just say we just want to know. We just want to know. And is it growing up in an age where there's just so much information that you have to wade through, that it's just now we just like don't bother with that, and we grow up being told all this. We just simple, plain simple, unadulterated truth. Is that what they're calling for?
I think what I've noticed in Gen Z is that there is this issue of misinformation and people doing that to make money fast. Something about the Bible is that it's really, really old and it's existed for a very long time. And so by turning to that, they know it's not for media sensationalization. What's written there surpasses all of the internet and surpasses all of that. And so it's a nice thing to look at. And also within the Church of England, I think there's also been this pushback against a lot of aspects of media and the polarization that comes with it. So there is the ability to actually walk in the church doors and forget all of the polarization outside and all of the battles that are going on outside, and just focus on the self and focus on how that links to a higher power and why there might be a higher purpose to all of this. It helps them to pull themselves out of those spirals they might be in and to look at things with better perspective.
But they still use the internet, don't they? My son went to a summer camp after New Wine, which is called Satellites, and there's about 5,000 teenagers. And he gets there and he says, "They know you, Dan. They know you. They know who you are." I said, "Dan," then I meant Dad. And so they are going out and using what they know, but actually wading through to find that truth. And so that was quite interesting, because I never thought I get teenagers watching. It's
That's funny actually, because I, from my generation perspective, thought about studying the Bible through seeing people online and seeing it online. So that's so interesting that then you said, well, actually, they're online too. And my brain for a minute thought, well, yes, of course. But it's true, because studying the Bible to you is in hand, to us it's online and available in various different versions and people conversing about it and such. So that's actually very interesting how that...
I think they say if you're born after 1980 after, you're like a digital native, and if you're before, you're the opposite. You depending on how close to 1980 you are, you can dip in and dip out. You can dip in and dip out. So when I had social media before. When I started doing YouTube, actually, I got sick of social media and pulled back, and I don't spend as much time like promoting myself as much, and because it's just, well, in one way or another, it's overwhelming. I haven't got the time. I'm not interested in all that social media. And then I see younger Christians who will do it all, and good on them. But because I'm in that kind of transition, I can do a bit. But yeah, you're right. Everything is, you get your Bible out and they get the phone out. Where do you go for information? Online. But again, that's why it's interesting that they're coming to the traditional services where it's the most polar opposite. Organ, choir, hymns, liturgy, priests dressed in robes. It's probably so refreshing. Is that the thing?
Yes, it's a completely different way of working. It's a completely different way of engaging with the world. And the internet itself is pretty boundaryless. You get every opinion, you get everything. And particularly for me, I notice about after midnight, if I'm scrolling on Instagram, it becomes very, very negative content very, very quickly. And I have to put it away. I don't know what it is about midnight, but suddenly the content that's suggested to me is suspicious, encourages people to cut their families off, encourages people to leave their husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, encourages people to think that everybody's sort of cheating or betraying and all of this, and it all suddenly floods my feed. So although I'm a digital native, it's also where, and I have no idea who is particularly behind that, because there's a few different sources, I think, and reasons for that. But one of the things that's worrisome is we are digital natives, but our parents aren't. So it's a group of very young people who are digital natives who are actually slightly sitting ducks for these sorts of attacks on family and society. The problem is, it's almost been so overdone, we stop noticing it. And so what we notice is the things that are different and positive and bring light, because then we feel better. It's like, oh, well, actually, in this situation, it can often be this or that. It doesn't have to mean this terrible thing. And then you think, oh, yes, that makes sense. And that sticks.
It's quite scary because I went to the ARC conference, so that was partly done with Jordan Peterson last year in November, and I was speaking to this guy who was like a internet cybersecurity expert. And what was interesting as I was speaking to him, he wouldn't touch my phone, right? Wouldn't touch my phone. But he was telling me how dangerous these apps are. Instagram, he was saying, and we was carrying on chatting. And at one point, he said, "Show me your settings on like Instagram and stuff." And he said, "Why have you got your microphone on Instagram? What does Instagram want your microphone for?" Well, you're looking at pictures and stuff like that. And some people do record things, but Instagram isn't one of those things that you would record so much. He said, "Turn that off." But he was angry. He's like, "Why? Like, you don't be so stupid." And you lot, I suppose, growing up as well in a time where it doesn't feel safe, that you are being spied on with all these apps, that they are influencing you, as you said, after midnight it suddenly changes, to talk about things which are, again, so unchristian. It's like, I wouldn't even say it's subliminal, because you notice it.
I think I notice it partly because this is something that I'm interested in. I've been observing my generation since I was young and writing about what I see happening to my peers all across the board from all backgrounds in the UK. So it is something that I'm likely to pick up on. But with my friends, when I mentioned it to them, they then said, "Oh, yeah, that does happen. I thought it was me just scrolling down the wrong parts of the internet." No, that just doesn't happen during the day in the same way it does. And then they would text me and say, "Oh my God, you're right, this actually happens." But they didn't realise that in the beginning. So some of us are aware of it and some of us aren't. I would say for Instagram, usually the microphone's enabled when you go to do lives, or if you go to make a video on Instagram, then obviously it'll ask you for access to your microphone, then you allow. But you can, if you're concerned about it, you can always make sure when you've made that video that you go into your main settings, or even probably within Instagram settings, and switch that off. And you do have some controls. There are some AI learning controls on Instagram where it says you can opt out of using your profile for AI learning. You have to make an application, and it all becomes very complicated and often doesn't really work. So there are some real concerns about it, and I would agree. Perhaps you do not want Instagram having access to your microphone all the time, because it doesn't say when using the app. It just says, "Do we have access to your microphone?" It doesn't really say any more, so I can understand how that can be a problem. I can see the logic there. I personally, and this is probably something most Gen Z do, we don't have important conversations about these sorts of topics usually near our phones. So we just don't really naturally think to be around that sort of electronics when we're having important conversations. And I have a lot of friends who, even if they go to sort of a psychotherapy session or something, they'll just make sure their phone's under something in their bag, under a coat or something. Some of that borders on, the real intense fear that shouldn't be there, and that can be a pathology, and there are aspects to that. There are also aspects to which, if I had to have a conversation about something that I thought was really sensitive, I just don't think I would have that near my phone. I think I'd just put my phone downstairs or something, or
That's crazy. That's crazy because we never think, again, just never think about that. But with this guy, because he was an expert, it kind of really scared me. Like, what he was trying to tell me something, but he couldn't tell me what. It was like, and so it's interesting that you guys are like aware of that, and that you are not having those conversations around your phones, which is crazy to think about. So
yeah, Echo shows and things like that. Echo shows, laptops. I always get a laptop where I can click something plastic over the webcam, so it doesn't function unless I want it to. Same with Echo shows. Say the Echo Show 15, for example, has a little latch, and if I'm going away, I'll open it up so I can see into my house, and the rest of the time, close it. And it's a mechanical function. It's not something that can be hacked, and I like that. But I think it's something that some people in the older generations are really aware of. They'll say, "Oh, I was using my laptop one day and this red light started showing," etc. But it's not always the case.
Yeah. So you say, let's plug your books. You say you've written a couple of books. What were they about?
So it's a two-part series, Reflections on the Decline of Belief in Science and Religion. My science book actually follows my observations of my generation. So it follows right from when I was about 7 years old, and I studied my generation. I looked at different children who were bullies or different children who were acting out, noticing that for a lot of those children, their father never came to pick them up from school. And I wrote these things down that I'd say, well, that's so-and-so's mother, and that, well, I don't know who their father is. Never seen him. Okay, blank. But then I noticed the blanks came up where the children were often acting out or were having serious behavioural issues at school. And I followed this all the way through, so across different areas, private schools, state schools, I saw what was happening. I saw what we were exposed to. As young as 12 years old, I remember children seeing deeply inappropriate and traumatic videos. But when I actually interviewed them about it in adulthood for this book, one of them actually started to almost be sick, just remembering a video that had been circulated when they were 13, and they were now 23. And the strong memory a decade later had them unable to finish their dinner. So there are some really strong traumatic issues that are in the science book. The science book also talks a little bit about the state of the economy, financial education that we don't have, and it sort of covers a broader spectrum, looks at the NHS, issues like missing that we're increasingly international, and that we need to realise that people with black skin can also have melanomas, and we need to know what they look like, and it's not in the books. So it really covers across the board with my generation. Reflections on the Decline of Belief in Religion covers specifically Christianity and the systems involved. So not whether God exists or not, but the systems. So issues of shallow recruitment, issues of marriage and divorce, issues of accountability structures, issues of abuse, mega churches. It covers all of those different aspects of church life, just looks at shadows and trying to shine torches on them and really discover what's going on there and how it can be fixed. And both of these books are in direct parallel to my ancestor Charles Babbage's works from 1830 and 1836, where he talked about the decline of interest in science because it wasn't being paid well and there weren't good, well, basically the people getting the accolades had been born into science as opposed to merit. And his concept of Christianity was that he believed in mathematics and he believed in science, but he also held a very strong Christian faith. So you can find those books in the back of both of my books.
And where can people find you online?
So on YouTube, I'm at Babbage is back, and on Instagram, I'm at babbage.is.back.
And only 2.
Only 2, yes. You can find me on LinkedIn if you search hard. And then if you do, tell me how you found me.
Yeah. So thank you so much for spending your time to speak about a generation which is kind of so far away from me. Gen Z. Appreciate you educating me. Actually, I've learned a lot about Gen Z and some of the stuff that I didn't know. But I suppose that's what you got to do. You've got to speak to those who are living it, haven't you?
Absolutely, and hopefully this sparks further discussions and further thought, and hopefully speak with their children who are Gen Z, find out a little bit more about what their real ideas are besides what is suggested or what the stereotype might be, because it might be the opposite of what you expect. So yes, thank you so much for having me on, and hopefully all of the audience will have found this somewhat useful.
And also, link down below is my interview that I did with Deborah over on her channel, where we spoke about safeguarding.
Yes,
and again,
it was fantastic.
Yeah, it was good. And again, at the same time, where I also left my window closed and got too hot and go red. Got a lead to open my windows. Anyway, but that's me. There you go. Old fuddy duddy. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for joining me on my channel.
Thank you so much for having me.